So first of all, the women. I found about 100 diaries, but the book's based on seven or eight women, and they're the women I could find out something about. This is Frances Crewe, who was one of the most beautiful women of her day. She married Baron Crewe when she was 18. She was a Whig supporter and part of the circle around Georgiana, the Duchess of Devonshire, of that film which was recently made. She was painted 3 times by Joshua Reynolds. That's one of the paintings. And this is where she lived. Crewe Hall in Cheshire, which is now, I gather, I've not been there, a very smart hotel. She had an affair with Richard Sheridan, who dedicated the school to scandal to her. And she travelled to Wales just for a week in 1795 with a group of women, which is most unusual. Most of these women travellers travelled with husbands and fathers and uncles. I think she was probably escaping from her affairs. And then we have, at the same period, Sarah Wilmot, who did 2 journeys to Wales. Somewhere in this picture here is her second husband, her husband. She was his second wife. Her husband, John Wilmot, but I haven't been able to find out from the National Portrait Gallery which one he is. They all do look a bit the same in those wigs. But there was a bit of serendipity with Sarah. In the National Library of Wales in Cardiff, there's a beautifully bound vellum book with lots of illustrations which will be included in this talk, and a diary, which I read early in my travels. And then I went to Lee, the Lancashire Record Office, and I found this little diary here. I keep forgetting I've got a pointer. And it had illustrations, and as I was reading it, I thought, déjà vu, I've read this before. And a bit more research uncovered the fact that Sarah Haslam, who wrote this diary, was the maiden name of Sarah Wilmot. And so this was a diary she wrote on her actual travels, and the diary Sarah Wilmot was the one she wrote probably in the winter's evening, in her smart home in London. She was the second wife of John Wilmot. His first wife, I'm a social worker, you can tell, his first wife ran off after 5 children with her groom. So there you go. Then he married the very lovely Sarah, and she did 2 trips to Wales. The third person is one of my favourite diarists, Lady Wilson, but the diary was written by her companion, Millicent Bant, who always called Lady Wilson her ladyship. And you'll discover later on that Lady Wilson likes her wine. But she was at her home, Charlton in Kent. She married a man at 18, over twice her age, so my romantic self thinks it was a love match. She was scientifically knowledgeable and could name thousands of mineral specimens. When the Napoleonic Wars ended, she gave a roast beef and plum pudding dinner to 300 poor of the parish. She was 57 on her first visit, and her last visit was in 1812, the same year when her son-in-law was assassinated, because her daughter had mistakenly married, or unfortunately married, Spencer Perceval, the only British Prime Minister to have been assassinated. Now, she interestingly mentions a coachman and a maid. People rarely mentioned the people they travelled with in terms of servants. And then we have Marianne Hibbert. If you read the book, you'll find that poor Marianne, her life is very unfortunate. She never marries. She quite often, on her trip to Wales, throws herself into gentlemen's arms, or throws her cap at them, but they never respond. And she wrote diaries all her life, and her last diary was very sad. She talks about being ill and being alone. But she did a lot of trips to Wales, beginning by coach, but on her last trips going by train. And she came from a family of wealthy merchants and planters who were, I'm afraid, in favour of the slave trade. Now, these 2 images, this is the house in This is the house in Llyfrgell. It still exists where she stayed. Obviously, it will have changed since she went there. And it belonged to somebody called Richards, who was the Lord Chief Baron of the Exchequer, and that's his portrait. So she must have been a gentry woman who knew the family, and the Richards family still own the house. The descendants are still there, and I've met them. And if any of you know Llyfrgell and the Torrent and Precipice Walks, they're in there on their estate. And my Welsh pronunciation, being English, is very poor, so you have to forgive me for that. And then Margaret Martineau, who was a cousin of Harriet Martineau, who was famous for her opposition for slavery, travelled with her uncle and various cousins. And this is just a photograph or a painting of Llanberis Pass. And this is what she has to say. These women were always cheerful, despite whatever conditions they travelled in. She said, this is typical, "It was hard rain. It persisted heavily and steadily. We were obliged to jump from one stone to another to avoid being over our shoes in water. The scenery, however, was quite grand enough to make amends for wet shoes and tired legs, though a mountain pass did not appear to advantage through a thick umbrella." And then she goes home and talks about that it's so astonishing. As soon as you get home, you forget about your tired legs and your wet clothes because you've had such a wonderful day. And then Elizabeth Bower was an Englishwoman whose father was a vicar, and she married a vicar. And she went through England and Wales on an 8-week honeymoon, I think with a servant called Mary. Now, I've had a phone conversation with one of her descendants who lives in Portugal, and I mentioned to him that the only thing I found out about Elizabeth was she'd left a lot of jewellery in her will. Yes, he said, she has a reputation even now in the family of being somewhat flighty. So all we know about Elizabeth is that she was flighty. And she has a lovely quote. These women never talk about their personal lives, or very, very rarely. They don't kiss and tell like we do these days. But this is what she says about her new husband. They've climbed Snowdon, and they're at the top of Snowdon. "Henry, more adventurous, must needs mount on a wooden pillar raised above the stones, and was insufferably conceited at having thus occupied a more distinguished and elevated position myself." So that's her comment about her husband. Okay, and the next person, and this is my favourite diarist. This is Frederico Roube. There she is. And this is Downton Hall, where she grew up. It's in Shropshire. And again, the descendants of the family still live there, and I've met them. And in fact, the portrait is not a very good photograph. It was a photograph I took inside this house. And Frederica wrote diaries all her life, and illustrated them with some delightful paintings we'll see later on. The cover of the book is one. And she, interestingly, didn't do what the other travellers did. She didn't travel all around Wales. She stayed in Dolgellau for a fortnight. So, in a way, the first sort of bed and breakfast visitor rather than traveller, and went out for exciting days from there. And she makes a lovely comment about her marriage. She came to Wales before she was married, but as I say, she wrote diaries all her life. And she had a lot of illness and came to Aberystwyth, actually, interesting, quite often to convalesce. And on one of her return trips from Aberystwyth, she meets her husband, and this is what she says. "I knew I must look very undemonstrative to please him while I was in public." He was stiff upper lip English. "I am sure we both acted our parts to perfection. But how quickly the ice melted when the spectators were gone." So I think that's a lovely romantic description of her marriage. So those are the women whose diaries I'm going to be using.